What if the biggest mystery in ancient Mesopotamia isn't what the tablets show us, but what they never wrote down? For 4,000 years, Sumerian scribes wrote down everything. Kings who were crowned and kings who lost their thrones, floods that rose and fell, wars fought under a blood-red moon, even the wandering path of Venus across the night sky. But in the sacred ruins of Nippur, where Enlil's courtyard once shook with hymns and the smoke from offerings rose toward the heavens, there is silence. No tablet explains it. The broken mud bricks remember rituals. The earth still holds the ash from sacrifices. Yet nowhere in thousands of clay pieces is there a single line that says, "The Anunnaki have left." They don't leave with celebration. They don't disappear with warning. They simply stop showing up. Their absence isn't a moment in Sumerian history. It's an empty space. Huge, done on purpose, and still waiting to be understood. So before you go too deep into this mystery, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy the kind of stories that move between forgotten temples and fading memory. And if you're still with me, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I'd like to imagine this question echoing across time zones the same way the Anunnaki's names once echoed across ancient cities. The story begins not with an ending, but with an absence. In the 1800s and 1900s, archaeologists working across southern Iraq at Uruk, Nippur, Lagash, and Kish dug up something extraordinary. Tablets upon tablets stacked like the frozen thoughts of an entire civilization. They were written in cuneiform, the world's first writing system, and they were already advanced when they appeared in history. No primitive scratches, no uncertain symbols. The Sumerians documented their world with precision. King lists, city inventories, hymns to the gods, astronomical observations, legal codes. And woven through hundreds of these texts was a name that would fascinate scholars for centuries. Anunnaki, the great gods, the council of heaven, the decreers of fate. But here's what should bother you. As you scan tablet after tablet in museum archives, beneath cold light, behind protective glass, you'll find the Anunnaki everywhere in early Mesopotamian thought. They judge, they bless, they assign destinies to kings and cities. And then, slowly, across centuries of records, their presence begins to thin. They appear less in royal hymns. Their names fade from ritual texts. The temples fall silent. Yet nowhere, not in a single Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, or Assyrian inscription, does any scribe record, "Today, the Anunnaki rose to the stars and left the earth behind." There is no goodbye, no cosmic departure scene, no final decree. Scholars have long struggled with this silence. History prefers clear endings, especially for beings that once dominated an entire culture's understanding of the cosmos. But the Anunnaki complicate that expectation. They don't vanish in a disaster. They don't board heavenly chariots in the night sky. Instead, they seem to dissolve, like a name whispered across too many generations, slowly losing its shape until no one remembers why they once spoke it with awe. Modern internet mythology has filled this empty space with guesses. YouTube videos claim they were aliens who returned to Nibiru. Fringe theorists suggest they fled a coming disaster. Ancient astronaut believers imagine spaceports hidden beneath ziggurats. But the clay itself tells a different story, one more subtle, more human, and perhaps more unsettling than tales of cosmic escape. Imagine holding one of these tablets in your hands. It's smaller than you'd expect, fitting in your palm, its surface covered in wedge-shaped marks that still carry the pressure of a reed pen from 4,000 years ago. This is not metaphor preserved in clay. This is paperwork, ritual schedules, divine family trees. Enki and the World Order lists the Anunnaki as a council, assigned specific cosmic jobs. Inanna's descent to the underworld places 7 Anunnaki as judges in the realm of the dead. Early Sumerian hymns describe them as the 50 great gods, children of An, the Sky Father, a divine assembly that shaped destinies and maintained cosmic order. They were not described as travelers from beyond the stars. They were not shown in metal suits or flying machines. They were the gods of rank, authority, and sacred law, woven so deeply into the Sumerian worldview that to live in a Sumerian city was to live under the Anunnaki's watch. Every ziggurat was a meeting place between their realm and ours. Every king ruled by their decree. Every offering fed their presence in the world. And then something happened. Not a single catastrophic moment, but a slow change that unfolded over 2,000 years. When Sargon of Akkad unified the Sumerian city-states around 2300 BC, the Anunnaki began to shift. Akkadian scribes still wrote their names, but now as part of a larger divine order, and became Anu. Inanna became Ishtar, and the Anunnaki, while still respected, were no longer the highest authority. By the time Babylon rose and Marduk was elevated to king of the gods in the Enuma Elish, the Anunnaki had become Marduk's divine council, powerful, yes, but secondary. Summoned, not supreme. By the Neo-Assyrian period, the term Anunnaki barely appears in royal inscriptions. By the late Babylonian era, the old names are ghosts, referenced in scholarly lists and priestly traditions, but no longer alive in popular worship. The temples that once rang with their hymns stood empty. The rituals that sustained their presence stopped. And as new religions swept through the ancient Near East, Zoroastrianism reframing old gods as demons, Judaism absorbing divine council imagery while condemning false idols, Christianity declaring Babylon's gods defeated, the Anunnaki were not destroyed. They were forgotten. How does a god disappear? Not by flying away, but by having no one left to speak its name. Not by abandoning the world, but by the world abandoning the conditions that made the god real within human consciousness. Some researchers point to the gradual shifts in political theology. Others note the rise of monotheism and its need to erase competing divine structures. A few scholars even trace faint echoes of Anunnaki worship lasting into the medieval period. Moon cults in Haran, ritual laments for Tammuz persisting in isolated communities. But the truth remains. At some point, the last priest left the last temple, and no one noticed the world had changed. In the Louvre, there's a boundary stone from the Kassite period covered in divine symbols. Stars, crescent moons, stylized animals representing gods. Among them, a row of 7 small figures, the 7 judges of the underworld, once called the Anunnaki. They're almost too small to notice now, crowded by larger, more prominent deities. It's a quiet visual confession of their demotion, from cosmic rulers to background figures in someone else's pantheon. Sometimes when you study these artifacts closely, you can still see the marks where a stylus slipped, where a scribe corrected a sign, where clay cracked before it dried. These are not the products of alien visitors or vanished supermen. These are the records of human beings trying to make sense of forces larger than themselves, forces they named, honored, and eventually outgrew. The silence in the texts is not the silence of beings who flew away. It's the silence of a civilization that stopped needing those particular gods to explain the cosmos. At night, in museum storage rooms across the world, thousands of these tablets rest in darkness. Fragments of hymns, administrative records, king lists, and prayers to gods whose names are now only read by scholars. And if you listen closely to that silence, you realize it's not empty. It's full of transformation, full of the slow, inevitable process by which human consciousness reshapes the sacred. We think we're searching for where the Anunnaki went, but perhaps we're really asking, how do gods leave when they were never separate from us in the first place? If Sumerian tablets don't record the Anunnaki leaving Earth, then what do they actually say about who the Anunnaki were? And what does that reveal about how gods disappear? To understand what happened to the Anunnaki, you first have to step into the world that created them, not as legend but as documented reality. Picture yourself in a scribe's chamber in ancient Nippur, sometime around 2400 BC. The room is small, clay-walled, with narrow windows that let in slanted afternoon light. On a low table before you sit fresh tablets, still damp, waiting for the reed pen that rests beside them. In clay jars along the wall are the records you're meant to copy and preserve. God lists, offering schedules, hymns for temple ceremonies. This is not mystical work. This is administration. The gods must be named in proper order. Their shares of sacrificed sheep must be calculated. Their family trees must be kept accurate so that priests know which deity to address for which request. You reach for one of the older tablets, its surface already hardened by decades in storage. Your finger traces the wedge-shaped marks. And there, pressed into the clay with the same careful precision as a tax record, you find them, Anunnaki, the great gods, 50 in number, children of the Sky Father. Not visitors, not travelers from distant planets. Divine rulers native to the cosmos, as the Sumerians understood it. This is where the modern confusion begins, and where the ancient clarity still waits to be recovered. In the earliest Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki are never described as beings who came from elsewhere. They simply are, the way mountains are, the way the Tigris and Euphrates are. They belong to the divine order that comes before human memory. The debate between winter and summer, one of the oldest surviving literary compositions, mentions them as the witnesses and judges of cosmic disputes. The instructions of Shuruppak, possibly the most ancient wisdom text we possess, references them as the authorities who determine the fates of cities. They are woven into the very language of power, justice, and sacred order. But it's in the myth Enki and the world order that their nature becomes most clear. In this text, the god Enki travels through the world assigning roles to various deities, putting each god in charge of specific natural forces, crafts, or regions. The Anunnaki appear as the grand council that must approve these arrangements. They are not workers or engineers. They are lawmakers of cosmic law. When Enki proclaims that the goddess Nanshi will oversee fish and waterfowl, or that Nasaba will govern writing and scribal arts, he does so with the Anunnaki's permission, because they are the assembly that gives divine decrees their binding force. Think of them less like astronauts and more like a supreme court, a heavenly senate whose decisions ripple down through the hierarchy of gods and into the human world. Their authority flows from their parentage. They are called the offspring of the distant sky god whose name literally means heaven in Sumerian cosmology, and dwells in the highest realm of the universe, far above the earth. Below him are the great gods like Enlil, lord of wind and earth, Enki, lord of wisdom and fresh water, and Inanna, goddess of love, war, and the morning star. And surrounding these major powers are the Anunnaki, the broader council of high deities who, in assembly, decree what shall be. Early hymns make this structure clear. A praise song to the city of Nippur, where Enlil's great temple stood, describes the Anunnaki gathering there to determine destinies. Another hymn addresses them as the great princes who stand by the divine plans and guard the decrees of heaven and earth. These are not alien visitors studying human civilization. These are the civilization's own gods, the sacred authorities that legitimize kingship, sanctify temples, and maintain the cosmic order that allows crops to grow and rivers to flood at the right time. Here's what they are not described as: wearing strange garments, piloting craft, manipulating metals for advanced technology, or descending from the stars in the way modern UFO mythology imagines. When Sumerian texts describe divine beings coming to Earth, they use the language of theophany, gods appearing in visions, entering cult statues during rituals, or descending through sacred gateways like the tops of ziggurats. The heavens they inhabit are not outer space. They are the divine dimension that runs parallel to the earthly one, accessible through sacred architecture and ritual action. This matters more than it might seem. When we impose modern cosmology onto ancient texts, reading descended from heaven as arrived from another planet, we lose what the texts actually reveal. The Sumerians didn't think of the sky as empty space filled with distant suns. They understood it as layered realms. The visible sky where birds fly, the higher realm where storms form, and beyond that, the divine sphere where the gods dwell. To say the Anunnaki were of heaven meant they belonged to that sacred order, the unchanging realm of divine law that gives structure to the chaos of earthly existence. Their connection to human cities was intimate, tangible, and entirely dependent on ritual maintenance. Each Sumerian city-state had its patron deity. Enlil in Nippur, Inanna in Uruk, Enki in Eridu, Nanna in Uar. But behind these major gods stood the broader council of the Anunnaki, invoked during kingship ceremonies, consulted during major decisions, and honored in festivals that marked the rhythms of the agricultural year. The ziggurat in each city was called an e-kur, a mountain house, an artificial sacred mountain where heaven and earth met. At the summit stood a small shrine where the god could descend to receive offerings and commune with priests. Imagine standing at the base of the ziggurat of Uar, its mud brick tiers rising in 3 massive platforms toward the sky. Pilgrims climb the long stairway carrying bread, beer, and incense. At the top, priests perform the daily ritual of feeding the god, setting out meals before the cult statue, changing its garments, burning fragrant wood. This is not superstition. This is technology of a different kind, the technology of presence, the carefully maintained system that keeps the divine order engaged with human affairs. As long as the rituals continue, the gods remain. As long as the gods remain, the world holds together. The Anunnaki's role in this system was foundational, but usually invisible. They were not the gods you prayed to for a good harvest or victory in battle. They were the cosmic framework that made those prayers meaningful. They were the assembly that empowered the patron deities. They were the witnesses when kings claimed divine right. In legal terms, they were the ultimate appellate court, the authority beyond all other authorities. But if you read carefully through the collection of early Sumerian literature, you begin to notice something. The Anunnaki are everywhere and nowhere. They're invoked constantly, but rarely individualized. We know the names and stories of Enlil, Inanna, Enki, and dozens of other gods in vivid detail. But the Anunnaki, despite their supreme authority, remain strangely collective, a council and assembly, a group that functions as a single force. It's as if they represent something more abstract than personality, the principle of divine order itself, the structure that holds the pantheon together. And that abstraction would become important later, because when empires rose and political power shifted, when new kings needed to reshape divine hierarchies to match their earthly ambitions, the Anunnaki's very abstraction made them vulnerable. Gods with names, stories, and temples could fight back, so to speak. Their priests could resist. Their cities could protest. But a council, a collective authority with no single face, that could be quietly reorganized, demoted, reassigned. Which brings us to the question that haunts this story. If the Anunnaki begin as the supreme council of heaven, unchanging witnesses to cosmic order, how do they start to change? Where, in the long record of Mesopotamian history, do we first see them moving away from their original roles? And what forces were powerful enough to shift beings described as the foundation of divine law itself? Meanwhile, while scribes in Nippur were still carefully pressing the names of the Anunnaki into wet clay, something was shifting on the ground, something that would eventually shift the heavens themselves. Around 2334 BC, armies began moving through southern Mesopotamia under the command of a man named Sargon. He was not Sumerian. He spoke Akkadian, a Semitic language entirely different from the Sumerian tongue. He came from the north, from a city called Akkad whose precise location we still haven't found. And within a single generation, he did what no Sumerian king had managed. He unified the independent city-states of Sumer under one centralized rule, creating what many historians consider the world's first true empire. This was not just a political revolution. It was a theological one. When Sargon's scribes began keeping records, they wrote in Akkadian using the same cuneiform script the Sumerians had invented. They adopted Sumerian administrative systems, Sumerian legal traditions, and, crucially, Sumerian gods. But they didn't simply copy them. They translated them, adapted them, reshaped them to fit a new imperial identity. The sky god and became Anu. The goddess Inanna, fierce patron of Uruk, became Ishtar. Enki, the clever water god, was now called Ea. The names changed, but something subtler changed too. The relationships between these gods began to shift to reflect the new political order. And the Anunnaki, they remained, but their role began to blur. In Akkadian royal inscriptions, kings still invoke the Anunnaki when claiming divine authority. But now they appeared less as the Supreme Council and more as part of a larger, less defined category of great gods. The sharp constitutional structure, the divine assembly that decreed fates, started to soften into something more flexible, more easily reorganized. This was the beginning of a pattern that would repeat across the next 1,000 years. When earthly power consolidated, heavenly power consolidated too. And the old council structures, designed for a world of independent city-states, each with its own patron deity, began to feel outdated. The Akkadian Empire itself didn't last long. barely 2 centuries before it collapsed under external invasions and internal strain. Sumerian cities briefly reasserted independence during what historians call the UR3 period. And for a while, the old order seemed restored. Temples were rebuilt. Hymns to the traditional gods flourished. The Anunnaki appeared again in their familiar form, witnesses to royal coronations and judges of divine law. But the precedent had been set. Empires were now possible. And the next one would reshape the divine world more dramatically than Sargon ever did. In 1792 BC, a king named Hammurabi rose to the throne of Babylon, at the time, just one among many competing Mesopotamian powers. Through military conquest, diplomatic maneuvering, and 43 years of relentless expansion, he transformed Babylon from a minor city into the dominant force in southern Mesopotamia. And as Babylon rose, so did its patron god, Marduk. Before Hammurabi, Marduk was a respectable but second-tier deity. He was the son of Ea, associated with water, vegetation, and justice. Important but hardly the supreme cosmic authority. After Hammurabi, Marduk would be reimagined as the king of all gods, the hero who saved creation itself, the deity whose will superseded every other divine power. This wasn't accomplished through conquest alone. It required a theological masterpiece, the Enuma Elish. When on high is often called the Babylonian creation epic, but that description misses its true function. It's a political document, a justification for Marduk's supremacy written in the language of myth. The story goes like this. In the beginning, the primordial gods exist in chaotic waters. The younger gods, including Ea, grow restless and loud, disturbing the older generation. A cosmic war erupts. The ancient goddess Tiamat, embodiment of the salt sea, creates monsters to destroy the younger gods. The divine council panics. None of the traditional high gods, not Anu, not Enlil, can defeat her. Then Marduk steps forward. He's young, powerful, brilliant. He offers to fight Tiamat on one condition. If he wins, he becomes the supreme ruler of the gods. The assembly agrees. Marduk slays Tiamat, splits her body in half to create heaven and earth, organizes the cosmos, and establishes the order of the universe. The other gods build Babylon as his sacred city and his temple Esagila as the center of the world. And then, in the critical moment for our story, Marduk reorganizes the divine hierarchy. The Enuma Elish describes the moment explicitly. After Marduk's victory, the Anunnaki, all of them bow before him. They proclaim him king. They surrender their authority to his judgment. Anu, the old Sky Father, formally transfers his power to Marduk, saying, "From this day forward, your command shall be supreme." And the 50 great gods who once formed the Supreme Council are assigned new roles. They will build Marduk's temple. They will serve in his court. They will enforce his decrees. Read carefully and you'll see what's happened. The Anunnaki haven't been eliminated. That would be too radical, too disruptive to centuries of religious tradition. Instead, they've been subordinated. Where they once were the divine assembly, they're now part of a divine assembly that Marduk controls. Where they once decreed fates collectively, they now receive their fates from Marduk individually. The constitutional order has been replaced by monarchy. This theological restructuring mirrored what Hammurabi was doing politically, consolidating many independent powers under one supreme authority. Just as dozens of city-states now answered to Babylon, dozens of deities now answered to Marduk. And the Anunnaki, once the framework of divine governance, became the bureaucracy serving a divine emperor. The shift shows up in how they're referenced in later texts. In old Babylonian prayers, you find phrases like Marduk assembled the Anunnaki or he commanded the Anunnaki to attend him. They're still powerful, still called great gods. But the grammar has changed. They're now objects of verbs, not subjects. They're acted upon rather than acting. In hymns to Marduk from the Kassite period, centuries later, the Anunnaki appear as his attendants, the divine witnesses who affirm his judgments rather than the judges themselves. It's a subtle demotion, easy to miss if you're not reading closely. The names are still there. The respect is still there. But the function has fundamentally shifted. Imagine a Supreme Court that still exists, but no longer has the power to rule independently. It can only approve decisions made by a higher authority. The institution survives, but its essence has been hollowed out. And this pattern continued as Mesopotamian history unfolded. When the Assyrians built their empire to the north, they elevated their own patron god, Ashur, to supreme status using the same theological logic. Ashur absorbed many of Marduk's attributes, and the Anunnaki became part of Ashur's divine court instead. The Babylonians would later reassert Marduk's supremacy, and the Anunnaki would shift allegiance again. They had become, in effect, a floating category, powerful but adaptable, prestigious but no longer structurally necessary. By the Neo-Assyrian period, around 800 BC, you can track the decline in how often the term Anunnaki appears in royal inscriptions. Kings still sometimes invoke all the great gods or the gods of heaven and earth, but the specific council of the Anunnaki is mentioned less and less. They're being generalized, absorbed into broader categories, losing the distinct identity they held in early Sumerian thought. What we're witnessing isn't dramatic persecution or sudden abandonment. It's something more insidious: institutional irrelevance. The Anunnaki were designed for a world of balanced powers, a world where no single god dominated and the council maintained cosmic order through collective authority. But as political theology moved toward empire and monarchy, that model became obsolete. The heavens were reorganized to match the earth. And in that reorganization, the Anunnaki went from being the supreme council to being honored guests in someone else's court. But here's where the story takes another turn, one that's both stranger and more revealing. Because if the Anunnaki were being demoted and reorganized in the heavens, losing their place in the upper divine hierarchy, where did they go next in the imagination of the people who still remembered their names? Did they rise higher into some even more transcendent realm? Or did they sink into the depths, into the realm where all old powers eventually descend? But then something strange begins appearing in the texts. Something that suggests the Anunnaki's demotion didn't stop at becoming Marduk's attendants. In myths composed during and after the Old Babylonian period, the Anunnaki start showing up in unexpected places, not in temples, not in the assembly of heaven where fates are decreed. Instead, they appear in the Kur, the Sumerian underworld, the dark realm beneath the earth where the dead dwell in shadow. And they're not visiting. They seem to belong there now, installed as permanent authorities over the land of no return. The most vivid portrait of this transformation appears in one of Mesopotamia's oldest and most haunting myths, the descent of Inanna. Imagine the story unfolding like a dream you can't quite wake from. Inanna, the goddess of love and war, queen of heaven, decides to descend into the underworld, to attend a funeral or perhaps to expand her domain, or to visit her sister Ereshkigal, who rules the dark realm below. The myth never explains her true motive, and that uncertainty makes it more unsettling. She simply goes, dressed in her 7 divine garments, wearing her crown, carrying her royal rod and measuring line, all the symbols of her cosmic authority. The underworld has 7 gates. At each gate, a gatekeeper stops her and demands she remove one piece of her divine power. At the first gate, her crown. At the second, her earrings. At the third, her necklace. One by one, the layers of her identity are stripped away until she reaches the final gate. Naked and powerless, no longer queen of heaven, but just a being passing into the realm of death. And there, in the center of the underworld, she faces judgment. Not from her sister alone, but from 7 divine judges who sit in solemn assembly. The text names them explicitly, the 7 Anunnaki of the underworld. They fix their eyes upon her, the eyes of death. They speak their judgment against her. And Inanna, who once decreed the fates of mortals, is struck down, killed, and hung from a hook on the wall like a piece of meat left to rot. This is not the Anunnaki of early Sumerian hymns, the grand council that stood beside Enlil in Nippur, that decreed the destinies of kings and cities. These are judges of the dead, gatekeepers of the final realm, authorities whose power operates in darkness rather than light. Their location has changed, and with it, their entire symbolic meaning. The shift appears across multiple texts from the 2nd millennium BC onward. In older Sumerian literature, when the Anunnaki are mentioned in connection with the underworld, it's usually peripheral, a note that some of them oversee justice for the dead or that they maintain cosmic order even in the realm below. But as time passes, that connection becomes central. The Anunnaki don't just occasionally appear in the underworld. They become primarily associated with it. In Akkadian incantations and prayers from the late 2nd and early 1st millennium BC, you find phrases like, the Anunnaki of the underworld, or the Anunnaki who dwell in darkness. When scribes list divine judges, they place the Anunnaki specifically in the Kur, the Mesopotamian land of the dead. In funerary texts, the Anunnaki appear as the beings who will judge a soul's deeds and determine its fate in the afterlife. They've gone from being cosmic legislators to being, essentially, the supreme court of death. This is a pattern historians of religion recognize across many cultures. When a new divine order rises, the old gods don't simply vanish. They descend. They're pushed down into lower realms, into the earth, into the waters, into the spaces that the new ruling gods don't claim. The Greek Titans, overthrown by Zeus and the Olympians, were imprisoned in Tartarus beneath the world. The Irish Tuatha Dé Danann, replaced by newer powers, retreated into the hollow hills and became associated with the dead. The old gods of pre-Christian Europe became demons in Christian cosmology, cast down into hell. In Mesopotamia, the mechanism was subtler, but the pattern holds. As Marduk rose, as later empires elevated their own patron deities, the Anunnaki sank, not violently, not explicitly, but layer by layer, text by text. Their primary domain shifted from the bright realm of heaven to the dark realm beneath. The gods who once assigned roles to other gods were now assigned the role of presiding over endings. There's a strange dignity in this demotion, though, if you look at it from a certain angle. The underworld in Mesopotamian thought was not hell. It wasn't a place of eternal torment, at least not in the way later religions would imagine. It was simply the place where all mortals go, a vast, shadowy plane where the dead exist in a diminished state, eating dust and clay, dwelling in darkness. Someone had to govern that realm. Someone had to maintain order among the infinite dead, to judge newcomers, to ensure the cosmic structure held even in the land of no return. Perhaps assigning the Anunnaki to this role was a way of honoring them even while displacing them. They were too powerful, too ancient, too fundamental to simply erase. So they were given dominion over the one realm the new supreme gods didn't particularly want to personally oversee, the realm of endings, memory, and the exhausted past. The Anunnaki who once witnessed the beginning of cosmic order now witnessed its conclusion in every human life. Or perhaps it was exile dressed up as honor, a way to remove them from active cosmic governance while maintaining the appearance of respect. After all, the underworld judges have power, but it's reactive power. They judge what comes to them. They don't decree new fates, don't shape the upper world, don't influence the living except through fear of eventual judgment. They've been politically neutralized, given a permanent office that sounds important but wields no influence over the world that matters most to the living. The texts themselves don't tell us which interpretation is correct, and that uncertainty might be the point. Religious texts are written by priests and scribes who serve the current political order. They're careful not to explicitly dishonor old gods. That would risk angering traditionalists. And besides, true power lies in quiet reorganization, not dramatic confrontation. So the Anunnaki are given the underworld as if it were a promotion, and whether it's honor or exile depends on who's reading the text and what they're willing to see. What's undeniable is the symbolic weight of the transformation. The Anunnaki began as gods of sky and earth, the highest assembly, the witnesses to creation and order. They've now become primarily associated with death, darkness, and the past. They've moved from the realm of becoming to the realm of ending. From the place where new kings are crowned to the place where all kings eventually arrive, stripped of their crowns. In Inanna's descent, there's a moment after the judgment when Inanna's corpse hangs in the underworld for 3 days and 3 nights. The world above begins to die. Plants wither. Animals stop mating. Nothing grows. Only when she's rescued by clever intervention and allowed to return does life resume. The story suggests something profound. The underworld must release what it holds, or the upper world cannot continue. The past must occasionally yield to the present. But the Anunnaki, unlike Inanna, are never rescued. They remain in the darkness, judging the endless procession of the dead. The question the texts leave hovering in that darkness is whether they chose to stay or were forced to remain, whether their descent was transformation or imprisonment. And that raises another question, one that takes us beyond myth into history. If the Anunnaki sank into the underworld in the Mesopotamian imagination, what forces on Earth, what historical pressures, what political changes, what religious revolutions pushed them there? Meanwhile, beyond the Tigris and Euphrates, new religious forces were gathering that would prove far more destructive to the Anunnaki than any imperial reorganization. Around the 6th century BC, a prophet emerged in the Iranian highlands preaching a radically different vision of divine reality. His name was Zarathustra, later known as Zoroaster, and his message restructured the entire logic of how gods could exist. There was not a council of deities, not a hierarchy of greater and lesser powers, but a cosmic dualism. One supreme god of truth and light, Ahura Mazda, locked in eternal struggle with Angra Mainyu, the spirit of chaos and deception. Everything else, all the traditional spirits, regional gods, and divine powers that people had worshipped for millennia, had to choose a side or be exposed as false. And here's where the old gods began to encounter something more dangerous than demotion: theological erasure. In Zoroastrian scripture, the traditional gods of the Iranian plateau and Mesopotamia were recast as devas, deceptive spirits who falsely claimed divine status. They weren't honored rivals. They weren't even acknowledged as real powers worthy of underworld exile. They were lies that had tricked humanity for generations, dangerous illusions that led people away from the one true cosmic order. The entire structure that had made the Anunnaki meaningful, a world where multiple gods could coexist in complex hierarchies, was being declared spiritually bankrupt. This wasn't just theology. It was an ideological weapon. As Persia rose to dominate Mesopotamia under Cyrus the Great in 539 BC, Zoroastrian thought began influencing how educated classes understood divinity itself. The old gods weren't being reorganized. They were being erased from the category of legitimate divine being altogether. But something even more consequential was unfolding to the west, in the aftermath of another conquest. In 586 BC, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II destroyed Jerusalem, burned Solomon's temple, and deported the Judean elite to Babylon in what history remembers as the Babylonian exile. For nearly half a century, Israelite priests, scribes, and thinkers lived among the ziggurats and temples of Mesopotamia, surrounded by the religious architecture of the very empire that had conquered them. And in that crucible of displacement and cultural contact, something transformative happened to their understanding of God. The Hebrew texts composed during and after the exile bear subtle traces of Mesopotamian influence, not in worship, but in the imagery and structures they used to describe divine reality. The opening of Genesis, where God's spirit hovers over primordial waters and creates through divine speech, echoes the cosmological framework of Mesopotamian myths. The divine council that appears in texts like Job and Psalms, where God meets with the Elohim, or sons of God to discuss human affairs, mirrors the assembly structure that once defined the Anunnaki. But here's the critical difference. Where Mesopotamian texts presented these councils as independent powers who collectively govern the cosmos, the Hebrew Bible subordinates them completely. They're not co-rulers. They're servants, messengers, or at most minor functionaries who carry out the will of Yahweh, the one God who tolerates no rivals. The old divine council structure has been preserved in skeletal form, but emptied of its original power. What were once cosmic legislators have become, at best, angels and at worst, evidence of false worship. The transformation shows most clearly in how the texts handle foreign gods. They're never directly named and honored. That would give them too much reality. Instead, they're referred to obliquely as the gods of the nations, as Eli Lim, worthless things, or as Avodah Zarah, strange service. The God of Israel doesn't defeat them in cosmic battle the way Marduk defeated Tiamat. He simply declares them irrelevant. They're not powers to be overthrown. They're illusions to be seen through. In this logic, the Anunnaki don't need to be specifically mentioned to be condemned. The entire category they inhabited, gods who govern regions and require ritual maintenance, has been rendered theologically impossible. There is one God who requires no feeding, who dwells in no temple because he fills all space, who needs no counsel because his wisdom is absolute. Everything else is idol worship, the fundamental error of mistaking created things for the Creator. When the exiles returned to Jerusalem after Persia conquered Babylon, they brought this refined monotheism with them. And as Judaism developed over the following centuries, it became increasingly clear in its rejection of the old divine structures. The prophets mocked those who worshipped gods that have mouths but cannot speak, eyes but cannot see. The psalmist declared that all the gods of the nations are idols, but the Lord made the heavens. The theological space where the Anunnaki had once existed was being systematically closed. Then came Christianity, and with it, an even more aggressive campaign against the old gods. Early Christian writers inherited Judaism's monotheistic framework, but added something new: a missionary urgency to convert the entire world, which meant actively dismantling competing religious systems. The Apostle Paul declared that the gods of the nations are demons. The Book of Revelation transformed Babylon from a historical empire into a cosmic symbol of spiritual corruption, the great harlot drunk on the blood of saints, destined for apocalyptic destruction. Everything Babylon represented, its temples, its rituals, its complex divine hierarchies, was cast as the opposite of sacred truth. This wasn't merely theological argument. As Christianity gained imperial power in the 4th century AD, it acquired the legal and military force to close temples, ban rituals, and destroy cult images. The gods who had once received offerings were now evidence of demonic deception. The priests who had maintained their cults for millennia were now serving forces of spiritual darkness. And the temples, those architectural meeting points between heaven and earth, were either destroyed or converted into churches, their old functions erased by consecration to the one true God. What happened to the Anunnaki in this process was death by irrelevance. They didn't need to be specifically targeted because the entire system they belonged to was being dismantled. Monotheism's fundamental logic made their existence impossible. If there is only one God, then the Anunnaki cannot be gods. If divine councils are merely metaphors for God's internal deliberation, then the assembly of the 50 great gods becomes, at best, a poetic fiction, at worst, a demonic deception. The question wasn't what should we do about the Anunnaki, but rather, why are we still talking about beings that never had the reality we thought they did? Islam would later complete this process. As Islamic armies swept through Mesopotamia in the 7th century AD, the final remnants of the old temple systems were systematically shut down. The Quran declared all pre-Islamic gods to be false, their worship a fundamental violation of Tawhid, the absolute oneness of God. Any lingering cult practices, any persistent local traditions that still honored the old names, were suppressed as shirk, the unforgivable sin of associating partners with God. By the time the last temple door closed, somewhere in the early Islamic period, the Anunnaki had endured a triple erasure. First, imperial reorganization had demoted them from cosmic legislators to divine bureaucrats. Second, theological demotion had pushed them from heaven into the underworld. And finally, monotheism had declared the entire category of their existence to be illusory. They were not defeated. They were declared to have never truly been. And yet, the erasure was never quite complete. Because religious memory is stubborn, and sacred geography doesn't easily forget. Temples close, but the stones remain. Rituals end, but the cycles they marked, planting, harvest, flood, continue. Names are forbidden, but the old associations linger in folklore, in place names, in half-remembered stories that grandmothers tell children when the priests aren't listening. Which raises a question that cuts against the official narrative of monotheistic triumph. If the Anunnaki were being rejected or demonized in new scriptures, systematically erased from legitimate religious discourse, were there still places, hidden corners, stubborn communities, isolated sanctuaries, where their names were quietly spoken and their presence still invoked long after the empires declared them dead? The answer is yes. But the places where they survived might surprise you. Travel north from ancient Babylon, following the Euphrates upstream through what is now Syria and into southeastern Turkey. There, in a landscape of rolling plains and harsh summers, sits the city of Haran, ancient Haranu, mentioned in the Hebrew Bible as the place where Abraham's family settled before their journey to Canaan. But Haran's older identity, its deeper purpose, was something the biblical authors chose not to emphasize. This was one of the most sacred cities of the moon god Sin, called Nana by the Sumerians, a deity whose lineage traced back to the earliest Mesopotamian divine structures. And remarkably, worship of Sin continued in Haran not just decades or centuries after the fall of Babylon, but for more than 1,000 years, well into the medieval Islamic period. When Arab geographers and historians began documenting the region in the 8th and 9th centuries AD, they found something unexpected in Haran, a community they called the Sabians, a people who still maintained temples, still observed astronomical rituals, still practiced forms of worship that seemed to echo distant antiquity. The historian al-Masudi, writing in the 10th century, described their temples adorned with planetary symbols, their priests dressed in distinctive robes, performing rituals tied to the movements of celestial bodies. The philosopher al-Biruni noted their elaborate systems of prayer directed toward the 7 classical planets, their sacred texts written in Syriac, their preservation of ancient astronomical knowledge. The Sabians of Haran occupied a strange legal position in the Islamic world. The Quran granted protected status to people of the book, Jews, Christians, and a mysterious group called Sabians. Though scholars debate who the Quran originally meant by that term, the pagans of Haran seized this uncertainty, identified themselves as the Sabians mentioned in Scripture, and thus secured a precarious tolerance in an otherwise monotheistic empire. They were, in effect, the last officially sanctioned practitioners of Mesopotamian star worship, hiding in plain sight by claiming the name of a Quranic category no one could precisely define. Their rituals preserved fragments of something far older than they perhaps knew. The veneration of Sin, the moon god, traced directly back to the Sumerian city of Ur, where the great ziggurat to Nana had stood 3,000 years earlier. The astronomical focus, prayers aligned with planetary movements, festivals marking celestial events, echoed the sacred science that Mesopotamian priests had perfected millennia before. And though the Sabians likely didn't use the term Anunnaki in their liturgies, they were maintaining a religious system structured around the same cosmological assumptions. That divine powers operated through celestial bodies, that proper ritual maintained cosmic order, that the universe was governed by sacred laws requiring human participation. But Haran wasn't the only place where the old patterns persisted. Scattered across the former Mesopotamian heartland, tucked into the practices of rural communities, and embedded in folk customs, other fragments survived. The ritual laments for Tammuz, the dying god of vegetation, known in Sumerian as Dumuzi, continued far longer than official religious history suggests. Tammuz was a complex figure in the old pantheon, lover of Inanna, shepherd king who died and descended to the underworld, whose annual death and resurrection symbolized the agricultural cycle. His mythology was ancient even by Babylonian standards, with roots extending back to the earliest Sumerian cities. The Hebrew prophet Ezekiel, writing in the 6th century BC, expressed outrage at finding Israelite women weeping for Tammuz at the north gate of the Jerusalem temple. This wasn't supposed to be happening. Jerusalem was the center of Yahwistic worship. Yet here were Jewish women participating in rituals for a Mesopotamian god. The detail reveals something important. Popular religious practice was far more syncretic than official texts admitted. People still marked the seasons with Tammuz laments because those rituals connected them to the cycles of planting and harvest in ways that transcended theological boundaries. And this continued. The 4th century church father Jerome complained about peasants in the Levant still observing Tammuz rituals in his time, 800 years after Ezekiel's complaint. Medieval Arabic sources mention communities in Iraq and Syria performing seasonal mourning rites in the hot month of July, which they called Tammuz in their calendar. Women would gather, sing laments, and weep for the dying god, much as their ancestors had done for 3,000 years. The content may have been Christianized or Islamized on the surface, the mourning redirected toward acceptable religious figures, but the structure, the timing, the emotional pattern remained rooted in Dumuzi's ancient cycle. These weren't organized cults with temples and priesthoods. They were memory fragments, cultural echoes, half-understood customs maintained because that's what grandmothers had taught daughters, generation after generation. The theology was gone, but the ritual gesture survived. The same way we might knock on wood or throw salt over our shoulders without remembering the gods those actions once invoked. But even these faint echoes couldn't last forever. The pressure was relentless. Christian bishops condemning pagan remnants, Islamic authorities enforcing orthodox practice, the steady accumulation of centuries that gradually wore away everything not actively protected. In Haran, the Sabian community faced waves of persecution whenever authorities decided their claim to people of the book status was fraudulent. Their temple was destroyed and rebuilt, destroyed again, converted into a mosque. By the 11th century, their numbers had dwindled. By the 13th century, the last unambiguous references to their astronomical worship disappear from the record. Somewhere, we don't know exactly when, in which year, which decade, someone performed the last ritual to sin. A priest, or perhaps just an elderly man who remembered how his father had done it, stood before an altar and spoke prayers that stretched back through the Assyrians and Babylonians and Akkadians to the Sumerians of Ur. He didn't know he was the last. There was no ceremony marking the end, no acknowledgement that a chain of worship, reaching back 3 millennia, was about to break. He simply performed the ritual and then, days or months or years later, he died, and no one carried it forward. Elsewhere, perhaps in a village in Syria or Iraq, an old woman taught her granddaughter the lament for Tammuz, the mourning song for the dying god of summer. But the granddaughter, converted to stricter Islamic practice or married into a family that scorned old ways, never passed it on. The last performance happened in obscurity, witnessed by no historians, preserved in no text. This is how gods die in reality. Not in cosmic battles or apocalyptic revelations, but in quiet abandonment, one forgotten ritual at a time. The temples that once housed the Anunnaki's worship suffered the same fate. The great ziggurat of Ur, where Sinanna had received offerings for centuries, gradually crumbled as the Euphrates shifted its course and the city was abandoned. The temple of Enlil in Nippur, center of Anunnaki theology, was systematically dismantled for its bricks by later builders who needed construction material and saw only ruins, not sacred architecture. The Asagila of Babylon, Marduk's temple, stood until the Seleucid period before finally collapsing into the earth. Layer by layer, mud brick by mud brick, the physical infrastructure of the old gods returned to the dust it came from. No one gathered to mourn these closures. No ceremonies marked the end. The priests simply stopped coming. The offerings stopped arriving. The doors stopped opening, and wind began moving through empty chambers. Perhaps a few old men, devoted to traditions that had lost all social support, tried to maintain the forms for a while. But eventually they died too, and the silence became permanent. By the time European archaeologists began digging in the 19th century, the temples had been buried so long that local villagers didn't remember what lay beneath the mounds. The Anunnaki had been forgotten so thoroughly that their name was a mystery waiting to be rediscovered by scholars reading clay tablets in museum archives. If the rituals finally stopped, the priests vanished and the temples fell silent. If no one speaks a god's name for centuries, if no one performs the actions that once made that god present in the world, what does it actually mean, in human terms, for a god like those of the Anunnaki to die? The answer requires us to think differently about what gods are in the first place. In modern thought, we tend to treat gods as either real supernatural beings who exist independently of human belief, or as complete fictions that humans invented. But the Mesopotamians wouldn't have understood either of those categories. For them, gods were presences, patterns of power, meaning, and sacred order that manifested through ritual, story, and place. A god wasn't simply real or imaginary. A god existed in the relationship between the divine realm and human practice. Think of it this way. Enlil's temple in Nippur wasn't just a building dedicated to an entity who lived somewhere else. It was the location where Enlil's presence in the world was most concentrated, most accessible. The rituals performed there, the daily offerings of bread and beer, the washing and clothing of the cult statue, the hymns sung at specific times, weren't symbolic gestures toward an absent being. They were the actions that maintained Enlil's active presence in the world. The god and the cult were not separate. They were interwoven. So when worship stops, when rituals cease, When stories are no longer told and names no longer spoken, the God doesn't go anywhere. The God simply stops being manifested, stops being present in the world in the way it once was. It's not death in the biological sense. Gods never lived in bodies that could decay. It's something more like fading, like a radio signal that grows weaker until it's indistinguishable from static. The German theologian Rudolf Otto explored this in his study of religious experience. He coined the term numinous to describe the distinctive feeling that accompanies encounters with the sacred, a combination of awe, fear, fascination, and overwhelming presence that he called the mysterium tremendum et fascinans. That feeling, Otto argued, is universal. Every culture experiences it. But how cultures interpret that experience, what they name it, what rituals they build around it, that changes. The energy Otto described doesn't vanish when one religious system collapses. It migrates. It gets reassigned to new forms, new names, new theological structures. The feeling that once occurred when a Sumerian priest entered Enlil's temple at dawn, that sense of standing before cosmic authority, didn't disappear from human experience. It simply got redirected. Perhaps it occurred next when a Jewish worshipper approached the temple in Jerusalem, or when a Christian monk entered the pre-dawn silence of a monastery church, or when a Muslim heard the call to prayer echoing across an ancient city at Far. This helps explain something puzzling about the Anunnaki's disappearance. Their structural function never really died. It just got repurposed under new names and frameworks. Consider the Divine Council. In early Sumerian thought, the Anunnaki formed the assembly that decreed fates and maintained cosmic order. When that structure was supposedly dismantled by monotheism, did the pattern actually disappear? Not entirely. It resurfaced in Judaism's Elohim, the divine beings who attend God's heavenly court in texts like Job and Psalms. It reappeared in Christian angelology, where hierarchies of angels, seraphim, cherubim, thrones, dominions, principalities, form a complex celestial bureaucracy surrounding God. It emerged again in Islamic tradition, with ranks of angels performing specific cosmic functions under Allah's absolute authority. The pattern persisted because the pattern served a psychological need. Humans understand power through hierarchy, authority through councils, cosmic order through delegation of responsibility. We need the universe to be organized, governed, maintained by forces greater than ourselves. When the Anunnaki could no longer serve that function, when their specific names and stories became culturally unavailable, the need itself migrated to new forms. The 50 great gods became 70 nations with their assigned angels, became 9 choirs of angels, became the 99 names of God, each fulfilling a similar psychological role, making the infinite comprehensible by giving it structure. Even when gods were actively condemned, their patterns often survived in inverted form. Early Christian demonology borrowed heavily from older pantheons, not just in naming demons after old gods like Baal or Astarte, but in maintaining the idea of hierarchical spiritual powers arrayed against heaven. The demons of Christian tradition often organized themselves like a dark mirror of the angelic hierarchy, which itself mirrored the divine councils of older systems. The Anunnaki's structural DNA persisted even in theologies explicitly designed to replace them. From a certain angle, this isn't erasure. It's evolution. The specific forms the Anunnaki took, clay tablets listing their names, hymns sung in Sumerian, offerings left in Mesopotamian temples. Those were adapted to the needs of city-states in the Bronze Age Near East. As civilizations expanded, as empires connected distant peoples, as trade routes spread ideas across continents, religious systems needed to become more abstract, more universal. A god who was specifically the patron of Nippur and spoke only Sumerian couldn't serve a multicultural empire spanning from Egypt to India. So the divine council structure generalized. The concept of cosmic hierarchy persisted. But the specifics, the 50 Anunnaki with their individual names and city associations, became too localized, too particular. The age demanded gods who could be worshipped anywhere, whose authority wasn't bound to specific rivers and specific temples. The old forms weren't destroyed so much as outgrown, like a child who stops playing with toys not because toys are bad, but because different activities now serve the developmental needs that play once fulfilled. This suggests something profound about the Anunnaki's departure. They didn't leave because they were defeated or exposed as fraudulent. They left because the human consciousness that sustained them evolved into forms they couldn't adapt to. The world became larger, more connected, more cosmopolitan. The old gods of place and particular cities couldn't scale to meet that expansion. New religious technologies, monotheism, universal ethics, portable scriptures, proved more effective at organizing meaning across diverse populations. The Anunnaki fulfilled their role perfectly for the world they were designed for. They provided cosmic order for independent city-states, each needing divine legitimacy for their rulers and sacred structure for their social hierarchies. When that world ended, when cities became provinces, when empires erased borders, when trade made every place less distinct, the Anunnaki's specific form of presence became obsolete. But their essence, the human need for cosmic order, for divine hierarchy, for sacred structure that makes the universe comprehensible, that didn't die. It's still active in every religious system that imagines heaven as organized, that structures spiritual authority in ranks, that sees the cosmos as governed rather than random. The Anunnaki are gone only in the way that Latin is a dead language, meaning nobody speaks it natively anymore. But its structure survives in the Romance languages, in scientific terminology, in legal phrases, in the grammar that shapes how millions of people still think. What died wasn't the Anunnaki themselves, but the specific cultural-linguistic ritual matrix that made them perceptible in that particular form. The tablets stopped being read. The language stopped being spoken. The rituals stopped being performed. And gradually, the specific way of experiencing the sacred that the Anunnaki represented became inaccessible. Not because it was false, but because the cultural technology to access it was lost. This is why the question of whether the Anunnaki were real misses the point entirely. They were as real as language is real as law is real, which is to say, they existed within and through human cultural practice, shaping consciousness and being shaped by it. When the practice ended, that form of reality dissolved, leaving only traces. Tablets in museums, names in scholarly indexes, patterns that migrated into new forms. But if the Anunnaki never left in a physical sense, if they only transformed, evolved, dissolved into structures we still use under different names, what do the tablets themselves still hold that modern readers are just beginning to understand? Return with me to where we began. The archive rooms, the museum storage facilities, the climate-controlled spaces where thousands of clay fragments rest under soft light. Each tablet is a frozen moment, a scribe's hand pressing into wet clay 4,000 years ago, recording what needed to be remembered. Some are the size of your palm, others barely larger than a postage stamp. Their surfaces are covered in wedge-shaped impressions that look to the untrained eye like abstract patterns. But to those who can read them, their voices, administrative records, royal hymns, temple inventories, mythological narratives, each one a data point in the slow transformation we've been tracking. Let's read them chronologically, like pages in a book that no one intended to write. The earliest texts from the mid-3rd millennium BC, the early dynastic period of Sumer, present the Anunnaki with clarity and prominence. In administrative texts from Nippur and Lagash, they appear in offering lists, quantities of bread, beer, and sheep allocated to the Anunnaki. In royal inscriptions, kings claim authority by the decree of the Anunnaki. In literary compositions like the Song of the Ho, they're described as the gods who approved Enlil's creation of humanity. They're not background figures. They're structural, woven into the language of legitimate power. A tablet from Shurapak, dating to around 2600 BC, lists the Anunnaki among the witnesses when major divine decisions are made. Another from Gersu records an oath sworn by En and the Anunnaki, invoking them as the ultimate guarantors of truth. In these early texts, they're treated as self-evidently important, requiring no explanation. The scribes assume their audience knows who the Anunnaki are and why their names carry weight. Move forward to the Akkadian period, late 3rd millennium BC, and the picture begins to shift. The Anunnaki still appear, but now often in Akkadian translations where Sumerian originals said something slightly different. They're still invoked in royal inscriptions, still mentioned in mythological texts, but the emphasis has changed. A hymn to Ishtar from this period mentions her authority over all the great gods. with the Anunnaki subsumed into that broader category. The specificity is beginning to blur. Old Babylonian texts, from the early 2nd millennium BC, show the transformation accelerating. Here we find the Anunnaki in Inanna's descent, sitting as judges in the underworld rather than decreeing fates in heaven. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, they're mentioned briefly as the gods who decreed that Enkidu must die, a decision made by the council, but one that feels mechanical, procedural, lacking the cosmic weight of earlier texts. They're present, but diminished. Still structurally necessary, but no longer the center of divine authority. By the Kassite and Middle Babylonian periods, middle to late 2nd millennium BC, explicit mentions of the Anunnaki become rarer. You find them in scholarly texts, in lists of divine names compiled by scribes preserving tradition. You find them in religious commentaries explaining older myths. But in contemporary royal inscriptions, in prayers composed for current use, the term appears less frequently. Kings invoke all the great gods or list specific major deities Marduk, Ishtar, Shamash, but the Anunnaki as a named collective are fading from active religious vocabulary. In Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian texts, 1st millennium BC, the references become fragmentary. A scholar copying an ancient hymn includes them because that's what the original said, but contemporary compositions increasingly omit them. The gods who matter now are the patron deities of empires. Ashur for Assyria, Marduk for Babylon. The old council structure is linguistically preserved but functionally irrelevant. Now, here's what's striking about this 4,000-year archive. Nowhere in any of these texts, not in the earliest, not in the middle periods, not in the latest fragments, does any scribe record anything resembling a departure announcement. There's no tablet that says, "In this year, the Anunnaki held their final council and ascended to the heavens, not to return." There's no royal chronicle mentioning that the gods withdrew from their temples. There's no priestly lament describing the moment when the divine presence departed. The silence is total, and that silence is itself the answer to our question. Modern minds, especially those influenced by science fiction and ancient astronaut theories, expect gods who came from elsewhere to eventually return there. We imagine departure scenes. Spacecraft ascending, portals closing, divine beings waving goodbye as they retreat to higher dimensions. We read ancient texts looking for that moment of exit. And when we don't find it, we assume it must have been hidden, coded, or lost. But the tablets reveal something more mundane and more profound. The Anunnaki didn't leave because they were never the kind of beings that could leave. They weren't travelers. They were the structure itself, the way Mesopotamian civilization organized its understanding of cosmic authority. And what the tablets document isn't their departure, but their transformation, the slow reorganization of that structure across centuries of political and theological change. Watch the pattern emerge when you read the tablets in sequence. Early, Anunnaki as Supreme Council, decreeing fates collectively, representing the distributed power structure of independent city-states. Middle, Anunnaki subordinated to rising imperial gods like Marduk, reflecting the consolidation of political power into empires. Late, Anunnaki relegated to underworld roles or absorbed into generic categories, as newer religious systems emphasized individual supreme deities over councils. Final, Anunnaki mentioned only in scholarly copies of ancient texts, their active function replaced by monotheistic frameworks that had no structural place for divine assemblies. This is what theological evolution looks like in real time, documented in clay. Not a dramatic event, but a gradual drift. Names used less frequently, roles reassigned, importance diminished, until eventually the term survives only as an artifact of linguistic history. The tablets don't record the Anunnaki leaving Earth because that's not what happened. What happened was that Mesopotamian civilization evolved beyond the religious structures that made the Anunnaki meaningful. City-states became empires. Local gods became universal ones. Polytheistic systems were challenged and eventually replaced by monotheistic ones. And in that transformation, the Anunnaki, like countless other divine figures, were reorganized, reassigned, and finally made obsolete. Here's the synthesis. The archaeology shows us temples abandoned not in catastrophe, but in gradual neglect. The textual evidence shows us names fading from active use over centuries. The religious history shows us new systems absorbing and redefining older structures. The psychology shows us how sacred presence migrates when ritual ceases. Every strand of evidence points to the same conclusion. The Anunnaki changed with us, not independent of us. They were never separate from the civilization that conceived them. When that civilization evolved, when new empires brought new political structures, when new religions offered new ways of understanding the sacred, the Anunnaki evolved too. From cosmic legislators to divine bureaucrats to underworld judges to half-remembered names in ancient texts, each transformation tracked exactly with changes in human political and religious organization. The tablets reveal this, if you read them not for what they confirm about modern theories, but for what they actually say, that the story of the Anunnaki is the story of how humans organize power, authority, and meaning through divine structures. When those structures no longer serve their purpose, they don't violently collapse. They gradually fade, repurposed or abandoned as consciousness finds new forms. If this is what the tablets quietly reveal, that the Anunnaki's departure was really our evolution, that their absence is really our transformation, then what does that mean for us? Standing now in museum archives and desert ruins, still asking about gods who vanished thousands of years ago, you're standing in the ruins again. Not the museum archives with their controlled temperature and protective glass, but the actual place where it all began, Nippur, or what remains of it, in southern Iraq, where the wind carries sand across broken mud brick. This late afternoon, moving toward dusk, the ziggurat of Enlil, once the most sacred structure in Sumer, the place where the Anunnaki gathered to decree the fates of kings, is now just a massive mound of eroded earth with ancient walls barely visible beneath centuries of accumulated dust. The shadows are lengthening. The heat of the day is finally breaking. And as you walk through what was once the sacred courtyard, the same wind that moved across these stones when priests performed dawn rituals 4,000 years ago moves across them now, indifferent to the collapse of everything that once made this place the center of the world. But something has changed since you first arrived at these ruins, asking where the Anunnaki went. Now you understand. They didn't go anywhere. They transformed layer by layer through mechanisms we've traced across 9 chapters of evidence. Political reorganization, theological demotion, religious replacement, ritual abandonment, cultural evolution, and finally the simple fading that occurs when no one speaks a name anymore. The Anunnaki were never visitors who could pack up and leave. They were the way an entire civilization structured its relationship with cosmic authority, with sacred order, with the forces that made rivers flood predictably and kings rule legitimately and cities prosper under divine protection. They were the answer ancient Mesopotamia gave to the fundamental human questions. Who governs the cosmos? What makes power legitimate? How do we connect the eternal with the temporary, the divine with the earthly? And when those questions needed different answers, when city-states became empires, when local gods needed to become universal, when polytheism gave way to monotheism, the Anunnaki didn't resist or flee. They simply dissolved into new forms. Their structural DNA preserved even as their specific identity faded. The divine council became the angelic hierarchy. The cosmic legislators became celestial bureaucrats. The witnesses of fate became the judged rather than the judges. The names changed, the story shifted, and eventually, even the memory grew faint, until all that remained were clay tablets waiting in the dark for someone to remember how to read them. This is the real revelation the Sumerian tablets offer. Not a hidden history of ancient astronauts, but something more profound and more human. The pattern of how we create gods to meet our needs, crown them with supreme authority, then slowly demote them when new needs arise. We reshape the sacred to match our evolving consciousness. And we do it so gradually that we rarely notice the transformation happening. The Anunnaki left when Sumer's world ended. When the last person who could read Sumerian died. When the final temple closed. When the rituals that maintained their presence ceased. But the sacred instinct that created them never ended. It just found new forms, new names, new structures. Every age builds its own divine architecture, its own way of organizing the mystery that Otto called the numinous. The specific form the Anunnaki took, 50 great gods in assembly, decreeing fates from a ziggurat in Nippur, that form was perfectly adapted to Bronze Age Mesopotamia. When that world ended, the form ended with it. Which brings us to this moment, to why we're still asking about the Anunnaki thousands of years after their names stopped being spoken in prayer. Our modern obsession with ancient aliens and lost civilizations isn't really about history. It's mythology dressed in the language of science fiction. New stories we're telling about old mysteries, new ways of making the distant past seem more dramatic, more relevant, more connected to our technological present. When we imagine the Anunnaki as extraterrestrials, we're doing exactly what the Babylonians did when they reimagined them as Marduk's servants. We're reshaping old gods to fit our current worldview. The Babylonians needed imperial hierarchy, so they made the Anunnaki into subordinates. We're fascinated by space travel and advanced technology, so we make them into ancient astronauts. In a strange way, this means the Anunnaki are still alive, not as the beings the Sumerians worshipped, but as symbols we continue to reshape according to our needs. Every YouTube video claiming they were aliens, every documentary speculating about their technology, every theory about their return, these are the modern rituals, the contemporary way of keeping their names in circulation. We've replaced temple offerings with internet attention, hymns with podcast episodes, clay tablets with digital archives. The form has changed completely, but the impulse remains. We're still trying to make sense of these ancient beings, still trying to fit them into frameworks that help us understand our place in the cosmos. Perhaps every age creates its own version of the Anunnaki, its own mysterious powers that seem to operate beyond normal human comprehension. The Sumerians made them divine legislators. The Babylonians made them imperial servants. The Zoroastrians and Christians made them demons or false gods. And we've made them aliens, visitors from beyond who possessed knowledge we're only now beginning to rediscover. Each interpretation reveals more about the interpreters than about the interpreted. Stand here in the ruins as the last light fades, and you can almost feel the weight of that pattern, the endless human cycle of reaching toward the sacred, giving it form and name and ritual, then watching those forms slowly change or fade as consciousness evolves. The Anunnaki are just one instance of something that happens over and over. Gods rise when they serve a need, and they fall when they no longer do. Not because they were false, but because the human world that sustained them transformed into something new. The tablets sit in museums now, behind glass, under conservation quality light. Scholars study them, translating the wedge-shaped marks back into words, reconstructing the myths and hymns and administrative records that once made the Anunnaki real within Mesopotamian consciousness. And in that act of reading, something peculiar happens. The Anunnaki flicker back into a kind of existence, not the existence they had when priests fed their statues and sang their praises, but a different kind, the existence of being known, remembered, studied, wondered about. Maybe that's all gods ever were, patterns of meaning that exist in the relationship between human consciousness and the mysteries it faces. They're real when they're active in culture, when rituals maintain them and stories transmit them and communities organize around them. They fade when that cultural support dissolves. And they can return in altered forms when new communities find new reasons to remember them. The wind moves across the ruins, the same wind that's been blowing here for 5,000 years. The ziggurat is barely visible now in the gathering darkness, just a massive shadow against the slightly lighter sky. Somewhere beneath your feet are tablets still unexcavated, still waiting in the earth, still holding marks pressed there by hands that wanted to preserve something against the erasing power of time. Those tablets won't tell you where the Anunnaki went, but they'll tell you something more important. How human beings have always reached toward the infinite, given it names and forms, built structures to honor it, then watched those structures crumble as the world changed and new forms became necessary. Every age has its own Anunnaki, its own way of naming the mystery, its own structures for encountering the sacred, its own gods that seem eternal until they're not. The Sumerians had their cosmic council. We have our own frameworks now, our own ways of organizing meaning and power and the sense that something larger than us governs existence. You turn from the ruins and begin walking back as darkness settles. The question that lingers isn't, where did the Anunnaki go? That's answered. They dissolved into the transformation of human consciousness, repurposed and renamed and eventually forgotten except as subjects of scholarly study and speculative reinterpretation. The question that lingers is softer, more unsettling, more immediate. If the Anunnaki are what happens when a civilization tries to make sense of the cosmos, when it builds divine structures to organize meaning, then watches those structures slowly become obsolete, what new gods are we quietly shaping today? What names are we giving to the mystery? What rituals are we performing without recognizing them as sacred? And when future archaeologists dig through our ruins, what will they conclude about the powers we honored, then forgot, then transformed into something they won't quite recognize? The tablets hold their silence. The wind continues, and somewhere in the dark the pattern repeats, as it always has, as perhaps it always will.